Some stories appear suddenly. A viral video, a shocking headline, a family the internet claims it has just discovered. But the truth is almost always quieter than that. Long before millions of people searched the name Whittaker, long before online debates about exploitation or compassion, there was only a narrow road in southern Appalachia and a house sitting quietly beyond it. A house neared. The moment that would eventually introduce the Whittaker family to the world did not begin with cameras. It began with hesitation. A car slowing on a dirt road, a stranger stepping out, and a household that had every reason to be suspicious of anyone who arrived uninvited. Because by the early 2000s, the Whittaker family already understood something painful about the outside world. Strangers did not always arrive with good intentions. Some came because they had heard rumors. Some came because curiosity drew them down the road. And some came for reasons far less generous. To stay, to laugh, to tell stories afterward about the strange family living in the hills. That kind of attention changes people. It teaches them caution. It teaches them to read faces carefully. And it teaches them that not every visitor deserves to be welcomed. So when a photographer named Mark Laita drove into the area in 2004, he was not arriving at a place waiting to be discovered. He was arriving at a place already shaped by years of unwanted attention. The road that led to the Whittaker house did not advertise itself. Like many rural roads across West Virginia, it wound through wooded hills and quiet valleys. One turn after another, pavement eventually fading into gravel, homes appearing only occasionally between the trees. The deeper you drove, the quieter everything became. People unfamiliar with Appalachia often imagine silence as peaceful, but the silence of remote communities is not always peace. Sometimes it is distance. Distance from jobs. Distance from hospitals. Distance from the kind of infrastructure most Americans take for granted. And sometimes it is distance from the protection that comes with being visible. Families living in places like odd often exist outside the attention of the wider world. That can be comforting, but it can also make them vulnerable. The Whittakers lived inside that balance. Their home was part of a region shaped by generations of economic hardship. Coal mining once supported entire communities across southern West Virginia. But as the coal industry declined during the late 20th century, many towns experienced sudden economic collapse. Jobs disappeared, businesses closed, and younger generations moved away searching for opportunities elsewhere. Communities like ours were left behind. Yet even as economic struggles grew, the landscape remained breathtaking. The mountains of the Appalachian Mountains rolled endlessly across the horizon. Forests covered the hillsides. Streams cut quietly through narrow hollows. From a distance, the region looked untouched. But beauty and hardship often lived side by side. And for the Whittaker family, daily life unfolded far from the institutions that shape most Americans' routines. Their world was small. Their social circle was limited. And the rhythms of their lives remained largely unknown beyond the small community around them. That is why the moment Mark Laita arrived carries so much meaning. Because the Whittakers were not simply waiting for someone to find them. They were protecting themselves from the very act of being found. Neighbors in the area understood this. Some residents quietly helped the family when they could. Others defended them fiercely from outsiders who came looking for entertainment. Stories later circulated about visitors being confronted. Warnings delivered clearly. Leave them alone. Because in communities like this, reputation spreads quickly. And by the time Mark arrived, the reputation surrounding the Whittakers was already complicated. People spoke about them in whispers. Some described them with sympathy. Others described them with ridicule. But the family themselves rarely participated in those conversations. They lived their lives quietly inside their own routines. So when a stranger drove down that road with a camera, the moment carried weight long before anyone understood what it might become. Who was he? Why was he there? And what did he want from them? These were not abstract questions. They were questions about safety, about dignity, about whether this visitor would treat the family like people or like a spectacle. That uncertainty hung over the property the day Mark arrived. Accounts of the encounter described confusion. Voices raised in alarm. A family unsure whether the stranger in front of them could be trusted. But if we only focus on Mark's reaction to what he saw, we miss the deeper reality. Because what felt unusual to him was simply the Whittakers' normal life. Their way of communicating, their way of reacting to strangers, their way of protecting each other. To outsiders, those reactions might appear chaotic, but inside the household, they carried meaning. Signals of warning, signals of caution, signals that someone unfamiliar had entered their space. And somewhere beyond the house itself, another presence existed. Neighbors, people who had watched outsiders approach the Whittaker property before. People who understood that curiosity can quickly turn cruel when vulnerable families become objects of gossip. That protective atmosphere formed the background of the first encounter, which is why the most important question about that day is not what Mark saw. The important question is what the Whittakers saw when they looked back at him. Did they see another person coming to laugh? Another stranger collecting a story to tell elsewhere? Or someone who might approach them differently? That moment of judgment happened silently. In glances, in body language, in the subtle ways people evaluate whether a stranger belongs in their space. For a while, the answer seemed uncertain. The household remained tense. Voices carried unease. No one fully understood what the stranger intended to do. But then something unexpected happened. According to later accounts, the turning point came not through persuasion or curiosity. It came through grief. A member of the family had recently passed away. Funeral arrangements were still fresh in the household's memory. And Mark offered something simple. A portrait, not a spectacle, not a story. A photograph meant to honor someone who had died. That offer changed the emotional geometry of the encounter. Because grief is one of the few human experiences that crosses every boundary. Class, education, culture, location. Every family understands the need to remember their dead with dignity. In that moment, Mark was no longer just a stranger with a camera. He was someone offering help during mourning. And the Whittakers recognized the difference. They may not have trusted him completely. They may not have understood exactly what his project would eventually become. But they understood the gesture. Someone had died, and this man wanted to help them remember. That small act of respect opened a narrow door. Not wide, not permanent, but enough. Enough to allow a stranger a few minutes inside their world. Enough to allow photographs. Enough to begin a relationship that no one present that day could possibly have predicted. Because standing in that yard in 2004, no one knew what would follow. No viral videos. No debates about exploitation. No millions of viewers analyzing every moment of the Whittakers' lives. There was only a photographer, a grieving family, and a fragile decision to allow one stranger a step closer than the others. That moment may appear small in hindsight, but it changed everything, because from that point forward, the Whittaker story was no longer entirely private. A thread had been tied between their isolated household and the wider world. And threads, once tied, have a way of pulling stories outward in ways no one can fully control. The first meeting between Mark Laita and the Whittaker family did not instantly become a friendship. It was something far more fragile. A test. Trust does not appear all at once, especially in places where strangers have arrived before for the wrong reasons. For families who have lived through ridicule or intrusion, trust forms slowly, sometimes over years rather than hours. That is what makes the early encounters between Mark and the Whittakers so important. Because the first visit did not end the tension. It only changed the tone of it. After the funeral portrait was taken, the atmosphere inside the home reportedly softened slightly. Not dramatically, not enough to turn strangers into friends overnight, but enough for the family to allow a few photographs, enough to allow conversation, enough to allow the stranger to remain a little longer. The Whittakers were still cautious. Their reactions to outsiders remained defensive at times. Their communication patterns did not resemble what most visitors expected. Voices rose and fell unpredictably. Words came slowly or not at all. But what appeared unusual to an outsider was simply their household rhythm. This was how they communicated, how they protected one another, how they responded when unfamiliar people entered their space. And gradually, Mark realized something important. If he wanted to understand the family, he would have to adjust his expectations, not the other way around. That realization shaped the next phase of the relationship, because instead of treating the Whittakers like a spectacle, he began returning in a way that resembled something closer to ordinary visitation. Short visits, simple conversations, photographs taken slowly rather than aggressively. Trust does not come from one grand gesture. It comes from repetition, from showing up again and again. Over time, the family began to recognize him. Recognition matters in isolated communities. Familiar faces become less threatening. Patterns become predictable, and the unknown begins to feel slightly less dangerous. By returning respectfully rather than disappearing after a single visit, Mark slowly changed how the family interpreted his presence. He was no longer just the stranger who arrived once with a camera. He became someone they had seen before, someone whose behavior they could measure over time. Still cautious, still uncertain, but gradually less suspicious. The geography of Odd played an important role in that process. Isolation creates a different relationship with outsiders. In large cities, strangers appear constantly. People expect unfamiliar faces. But in rural communities, especially those scattered through the Appalachian mountains, a single unfamiliar vehicle can attract attention immediately. Residents notice. Neighbors talk. Word spreads. By returning repeatedly, Mark became part of the local pattern rather than a single disruptive event. But even as familiarity grew, another factor shaped the relationship. Observation. Because while the outside world would later watch the Whittakers through videos and photographs, the family themselves were watching Mark just as carefully. They were learning how he behaved, whether he mocked them, whether he treated them with patience, whether his visits brought trouble or respect. That quiet evaluation likely determined whether he would ever be allowed to return again. And gradually, the answer seemed to become yes. Over the years that followed, Mark continued visiting the family, sometimes to photograph them, sometimes simply to check in. Each visit added another layer of familiarity, another small step away from the tension of that first day. But something important remained unchanged. The Whittakers never became performers. They did not suddenly adopt the language of interviews. They did not transform into people comfortable with public attention. Their lives remained what they had always been. Quiet, unpolished, unfiltered. And that authenticity would later become one of the reasons the world reacted so strongly when the family eventually appeared online. Because the images people saw were not staged. They were glimpses into a household that had developed entirely outside the expectations of modern media. Yet at the time of those early visits, no one imagined millions of people would one day see those images. The photographs taken during those early encounters were simply part of a long-term project documenting people who lived outside the typical narratives of American life. Mark had already spent years traveling across the country photographing individuals who rarely appeared in mainstream media. People living on the edges of society. People whose lives told complicated stories about poverty, addiction, survival, and resilience. The Whittakers became one of those stories. But at the beginning, they were not yet symbols of anything. They were simply a family living in a remote corner of West Virginia. A family whose daily routines had unfolded quietly for decades before a camera ever appeared. And that quiet beginning matters, because it reminds us that the Whittaker story did not begin as an internet phenomenon. It began as a human encounter, a stranger arriving on a rural road, a grieving household deciding whether to open the door, and a relationship that formed slowly enough to remain fragile for years. What no one present could fully see was how that fragile relationship would eventually expand. How photographs taken quietly would one day circulate across the internet. How millions of viewers would begin discussing the family. And how that attention would bring both help and controversy into their lives. But those consequences were still far in the future. At the time, everything remained small. A photographer returning to visit a family he had met through an act of mourning. A household cautiously allowing someone from the outside world to enter again. And a relationship that existed almost entirely outside public attention. For nearly 2 decades, that quiet pattern continued. Until one moment changed everything. For nearly 2 decades after that first meeting, the relationship between Mark Laita and the Whittaker family remained relatively quiet. The visits continued. Photographs were taken. Time passed, and the world outside the hills of Odd remained almost completely unaware that the family existed. That long stretch of time is one of the most overlooked parts of the Whittaker story. Because when people encounter the family today through videos or headlines, it can feel as if everything happened suddenly. As if the Whittakers appeared online overnight. But the truth is very different. Nearly 16 years passed between that first encounter in 2004 and the moment the world finally saw them. 16 years of quiet familiarity. 16 years of occasional visits. 16 years during which the relationship between photographer and family slowly evolved. During that time, the Whittakers continued living exactly as they always had. Their homes sat in the same place. Their routines followed the same rhythms. And their lives remained largely unchanged by the outside world. In many ways, the family existed within a kind of protective invisibility. The mountains surrounding their home created distance from the constant attention that defines modern life. The forests of the Appalachian Mountains do more than shape the landscape. They shape time. Communities in these regions often move more slowly. Days are measured less by deadlines and more by routine. Porches become gathering places. Neighbors appear unexpectedly, and life unfolds at a pace unfamiliar to most urban environments. The Whittakers were part of that rhythm. To outsiders, their household might have seemed unusual, but within their own world, it was simply life. Timmy moved through the house and yard in the same patterns he always had. Ray spent time outside holding up the back of his pants as he walked the property. Family members sat on the porch watching the road, talking, laughing, occasionally arguing. Ordinary moments that felt natural to them even if they puzzled visitors. For years, those moments remained private, until technology changed the way stories travel. By the late 2010s, platforms like YouTube had begun transforming how documentaries reached audiences. Instead of waiting for television networks or film festivals, creators could upload their work directly to the internet. Stories that once might have reached a few thousand viewers could suddenly reach millions. It was in that environment that Mark eventually made a decision that would change everything. He decided to share the Whittaker story publicly. In 2020, a video featuring the family appeared online through his documentary project. The internet responded immediately. Viewers were stunned. Many had never seen anything like it. Here was a family living in a remote Appalachian hollow whose lives seemed untouched by the modern world. Their speech patterns were unusual, their behaviors sometimes unpredictable, their home modest and isolated. The reaction was enormous. Millions of people watched. The video spread across social media. News outlets began referencing the story, and within days, The Whittakers have become one of the most talked about families on the internet. But attention does not arrive in only one form. Alongside sympathy came curiosity. Alongside curiosity came criticism. And alongside criticism came debate. Some viewers responded with compassion. They saw a vulnerable family living in difficult conditions and wanted to help. Many asked the same question: how can we improve their lives? Donations began appearing. Supporters offered to send supplies. Others volunteered to help repair the home. For the first time, resources were being directed toward a household that had long existed outside the reach of most institutions. But the internet rarely responds with only kindness. Some viewers accused the project of exploitation. They argued that filming the family placed them under a spotlight they never asked for. Others questioned whether the Whittakers fully understood the scale of attention the videos were generating. The debate intensified as more videos appeared. Each upload brought new viewers. Each viewer brought new opinions. And slowly the story began expanding beyond the original documentary. Other content creators began discussing the family. Some visited the property. Some attempted to help directly. Some attempted to build their own platforms by talking about the situation. Suddenly, the quiet road leading to the Whittaker home was no longer invisible. It had become a destination. This new attention created a complicated situation. On one hand, the family began receiving help they had never previously experienced. Donations funded improvements to their home. Basic supplies were delivered. Medical care became part of the conversation. But on the other hand, the same attention that brought support also created pressure. People drove past the property hoping to catch a glimpse of the family. Some visitors were respectful. Others treated the house as a curiosity. The Whittakers themselves had little control over how their story was being interpreted. And the larger the audience grew, the more difficult it became to manage the consequences. Because when millions of people begin discussing a vulnerable family, the story no longer belongs only to them. It becomes part of the internet. And the internet moves quickly, faster than investigations, faster than careful understanding, faster than the slow process of building trust. Within a short time, the Whittaker story had transformed from a quiet documentary into something far larger. Questions emerged about finances, questions about who was helping the family, questions about whether outside involvement was improving their lives or complicating them. Authorities eventually became aware of the situation. Agencies responsible for protecting vulnerable adults began examining the circumstances surrounding the household. And that is where the story began to shift again. Because once institutions enter a situation like this, the focus changes. The question is no longer simply whether people are interested in the story. The question becomes whether the individuals involved are safe, and whether they are receiving the support they need. Investigations take time. Evaluations require medical professionals, social workers, legal authorities, all working to determine what the next step should be. For the Whittakers, that process eventually led to intervention. Members of the family were removed from the home. Medical evaluations began. Care arrangements changed. And the quiet porch where the family had spent so many years suddenly became empty. For many viewers who had followed the story from the beginning, the moment felt shocking. Because the family that had lived together for decades was now separated. And the internet began debating the outcome with renewed intensity. Some believed the intervention was necessary. Others believed the family had been broken apart unnecessarily. But the deeper truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. The Whittaker story had grown too large to remain private. What began as a quiet human encounter on a date road in 2004 had eventually become a national conversation. And once that conversation reached millions of people, the consequences became impossible to predict. Because attention changes everything. Even when it begins with something as small as a photograph offered during a time of grief. The moment a private story becomes public, something irreversible happens. Control begins to dissipate. The people inside the story can no longer shape how it is told, because millions of strangers now feel entitled to interpret it. That is what happened once the Whittaker videos spread across the internet. The family who had spent most of their lives in quiet isolation suddenly existed inside a global conversation. Some viewers saw vulnerability. Some saw poverty. Some saw a story about neglect that demanded intervention. Others saw something entirely different. A family living in its own way, misunderstood by outsiders who judged too quickly. The debate intensified with every new video. And as the attention grew, so did the number of people entering the Whittakers' world. Supporters began visiting the property. Content creators began documenting the family. Individuals offered help in different forms. Money appeared through donations. Groceries were delivered. Supplies arrived. For the first time in decades, resources from outside the mountains began reaching the household. But attention is rarely simple. Because with visibility comes scrutiny. Questions began circulating online. Who was responsible for the money being raised? How was it being used? Were the Whittakers receiving the full benefit of the support people believed they were sending? Some viewers trusted the people involved. Others became suspicious. The internet quickly turned what had begun as a human story into a contested narrative. Different voices began presenting different versions of events. Some insisted the family was finally receiving help they had needed for years. Others claimed the situation had become exploitative. And once those competing narratives formed, the story moved beyond curiosity. It entered the territory of investigation. Eventually, the situation drew the attention of authorities responsible for protecting vulnerable adults. Agencies tasked with evaluating cases where individuals may require additional care. These organizations operate quietly most of the time. But when they receive reports suggesting potential concerns, they are required to examine the situation carefully. That examination involves several steps. Investigators assess living conditions. Medical professionals evaluate physical and cognitive health. Social workers determine whether individuals can safely manage their own care. And legal authorities decide whether intervention is necessary. The Whittaker household became part of that process. For viewers following the story online, the intervention felt sudden. One day the family appeared in videos sitting on their porch. The next day, reports began circulating that members of the household had been removed from the home. Medical evaluations began. Care arrangements changed. And the life that had existed for decades in that house near Odd came to an abrupt halt. For many people who had grown attached to the family, the moment was deeply emotional. Because whatever someone believed about the living conditions, one fact remained undeniable. The Whittakers had lived together for most of their lives. Their household functioned as a collective unit. Family members depended on one another. Communication between them followed patterns that outsiders sometimes struggled to understand. But those patterns had developed over generations. Separation meant dismantling something that had existed for decades. Supporters of the intervention argued that professional care would improve the family's health and safety. They believed structured environments would provide medical attention that had been difficult to obtain in a remote rural setting. Critics saw something different. They saw a family that had survived together through hardship now divided by systems that might not fully understand their relationships. Both perspectives carried emotional weight. Because situations involving vulnerable individuals rarely present clear answers. Authorities must prioritize safety and care. But families also carry emotional bonds that cannot easily be measured by policies or reports. For the Whittakers, the change meant entering a world very different from the one they had known. Medical facilities, supervised care environments, schedules designed by professionals rather than by family routine. Such environments can provide essential support. access to doctors, regular meals, structured assistance with daily activities. But they can also feel unfamiliar, especially to individuals who spent decades living in a single place surrounded by family. The porch that once symbolized their daily life remained behind, and the road leading to the house grew quiet. For years, people driving through that area might have seen members of the family sitting outside, Ray standing or walking along the property, Timmy moving between the yard and the porch, conversations unfolding in the slow rhythm of mountain life. Now that scene no longer exists. The house still stands in the hills of West Virginia. The mountains remain unchanged, but the life that once unfolded there has moved elsewhere. At the same time, the legal questions surrounding the story continued growing. Investigators examined financial records. Authorities considered whether crimes had been committed during the period when outside individuals became closely involved with the family. Eventually, those questions reached the court system, and that is how the story returned to a courtroom, with the case involving Patrick Rourke now moving through circuit court. For the legal system, the focus is narrower than the internet's conversation. Courts do not attempt to answer every moral question surrounding the Whittaker story. They examine specific allegations, specific actions, specific evidence, and they determine whether those actions violated the law. The outcome of that process may take months, perhaps longer. But while the court works through those questions, the broader meaning of the Whittaker story continues unfolding in the background. Because the situation illustrates something larger than one family or one legal case. It shows what can happen when vulnerable lives intersect with modern media, when private households suddenly become public narratives, and when millions of people begin watching a story that once belonged only to the people living inside it. The Whittaker story did not begin with a viral video. It began with a quiet moment on a rural road near Odd. A stranger arrived. A family hesitated, and a small act of respect opened a door that had remained closed to most outsiders for years. That moment in 2004 shaped everything that followed. When Mark Laita offered to photograph a family member's funeral portrait, the encounter shifted from curiosity to dignity. The Whittakers were not responding to fame or attention. They were responding to something much simpler. Recognition. The recognition that their grief mattered, that their family, despite living far from the expectations of the outside world, deserved the same respect any family would expect during loss. From that single moment, a fragile relationship began. Over the following years, that relationship slowly expanded. Photographs became documentation. Documentation became storytelling. And storytelling eventually became global attention. Millions of people would later watch videos about the Whittakers. Debates would form about whether exposure helped them or harmed them. Donations would arrive. Investigations would follow. And the quiet porch where the family once gathered would eventually fall silent. But when we look back at the beginning, the most important detail remains surprisingly small. The door did not open because the family wanted to be seen. It opened because someone approached them with respect first. That distinction matters, because it reminds us that the Whittakers were never simply a story waiting to be discovered. They were a family making a cautious decision about who they would allow into their world. And once that decision was made, the consequences traveled far beyond anything anyone standing on that road in 2004 could have imagined. Sometimes history begins not with spectacle, but with a quiet moment of human decency on a forgotten mountain road.